Hi, this is going to be part two of the video prior, Don't Get Lost in the Tyranny. And in this video, I really want to try to go more in depth of what I mean. Because we can make statements about something that we believe is true. And within those statements, is even more information. And so I really want to try to go more in depth, about what culture had set up for each man, to follow. And with these setups, you know, is, you know, more or less tyranny that man has taken upon himself, and he doesn't realize it. Only when you really truly come to know God as your source and your provider, and that's just one aspect, then he will start, releasing those burdens that have been put on you by society. Now, I had already created part one and part two of the main breadwinner, and in that, I was looking up information historically because I had always wondered when the thinking of the man as the main breadwinner began. I always, thought that it's always been around, but when did it begin? And was it something that God himself had set up in the Garden of Eden, after God put Adam and Eve in there to work it, and eventually after sin, they toiled? Was that what God ordained? Is that what God wants for, man and woman, to become financially successful, to take the tips of the financially successful? So I looked at it historically. I would encourage you to check those videos out for yourself, because in it I lay out, what was said, when it began. And so you can get more in depth in that, but I'm just going to cover the surface of, when it began. And it didn't start, when Adam and Eve began. It wasn't something that God ordained. This thinking was started off by, the financially successful. And when something is said over and over again, it becomes a pattern. And when it's pushed on society over and over again, years after years, generation after generation, century after century, then it becomes an expectation and a responsibility. And, it began in the late 1800s, and you can find out for yourself in the main breadwinner part one and two, about the details of it. But prior to this thinking, the areas, I believe, around the United States, and it could have been around the world, it was agrarian, where more or less people, harvested, people hunted, but there was no source of pride like men have now, where they're going to college, they find a career, they learn from the financially elite to become financially successful. You're given tips on how to do that. And so that's when it began. So it wasn't always, the pattern that we know now in the world. And there was no source of pride about, oh man, bringing home the bacon and those responsibilities and expectations being put on him. It wasn't none of that. Man went out and he hunted because that's what he needed to do to feed his family. He harvested, so at least that they had bread and stuff like that. Women were allowed to work their jobs, and, apparently around that time, after the financially successful started their tyranny on man, they pushed women from their jobs and made them homemakers. And so that's where, when this thinking is pushed constantly and it's put on, generation after generation, it's proven that it becomes a cultural responsibility and an expectation. It's something that we have grown accustomed to. And since we have grown accustomed to it, it's like that there are laws tied to it. And you break those laws, you feel this shame because you're not lining up with what culture has said. And I had said in, previous videos that there are two shames that we have learned in this world. There is the godly shame that, you do something to break a moral law that God has set up, you're going to feel shame. But the enemy, through the financially successful, has set up another shame. And it's the shame of not following what culture has stated and the laws that culture has set. I want to try to set up a poor example. Let's say that we have this town and, automatically I come up and I say that we are not to have any more bacon in this town. And, people are wondering why that is. And so it's an edict that was put forth. No one's to have any more bacon. So, which means that they had to get rid of any kind of pigs that are in this town. So no more pigs. So that has been pushed to the next generation. They're not to have any more pigs. There's been a law against having pigs in there. No one can bring them in. And so later, let's say 3 centuries down, this law is still in effect. Well, somebody comes up and questions, why are we not to have any pigs? What's the deal? And, there's no one that can give an answer. So maybe this person goes and he, looks the information up, he researches, and, they, in their research, it was more like a recommendation. Well, the recommendation apparently turned into a law and an edict stating that there was no more pigs. But, a recommendation and an edict are two different things. So this person starts questioning this whole edict. He's saying there's nothing wrong with pigs. It's something that God had created and we should be able to have them. So when you get enough people realizing that this recommendation turned into an edict, then they start rebelling against this supposed law. So similarly, when we have enough people that, question something that has been set up, like this financially successful, mentality. It's not something that should be an edict. It was something that was a recommendation for, those that choose to be financially successful. Maybe in the past, somebody that was financially successful said to somebody that wasn't that, hey, these are the choices that I've made. You should do these kind of choices. It wasn't a law set up. There wasn't that person that made them feel bad for not being what they are. It was just, a recommendation. Now, you get enough people that become financially successful, they start pushing it on other people. Pride then comes in saying, I have what you don't have. And they start making people that are not like them feel even worse. So with this, financially successful mentality, since it started off as possibly a recommendation in the late 1800s, it was pushed on a man. Since the wife was moved out of her role of the job that she enjoyed, she was pushed to be a homemaker. And then this thinking came up that, okay, only the man is allowed to work. Now, children, used to work in factories to help out the family. Well, that eventually had stopped, and that was a good thing. And And the reason why these children worked in the factories is because adults couldn't get into a certain areas. Only the kids could, to clean or something, a part or whatever it was. So that eventually stopped. But, the man was pushed into that role as, a provider. So maybe it started with one or two men, who were financially successful. So after decades upon decades, expectation, recommendation eventually turned into a responsibility. Okay, if you don't do this, then you are not a good father, you are not a good parent, and you're not a good husband. So that, expectation turned into a responsibility and like a moral law that was broken. So that is why when, men are corrected by the financially successful, they feel this ungodly shame because they're going against the pattern that has been set up, years prior. And, just because something is a tradition doesn't make it true or right. And I had stated that in, various videos. So this is not a moral, godly law that God has set up. It's a man law. So these men laws have to be broken. And if you decide to follow these kind of laws, then you're really only holding yourself back from really experiencing who God is as the source. It never was God's intent for man to be under this kind of tyranny. It was always God's intent for us to walk in freedom. And, that is basically what the enemy wants, is for man to walk in tyranny. Because if he's burdened down with all the, under all these worries, then he's not going to see God as his source. And so, when I, surrendered my life to God, and it was just not my life, because people, Christians can surrender their life and then still pursue their worldly pursuits. I more or less surrendered my will, which meant that I was going to have God lead me into what I needed to do. And so since I had done that, he was showing me everything that I had learned from this world that held me back from him. And one of them was that mentality that I had to let go of being on the path of, financially successful for the quote unquote good of my family. So he came against that, and he taught me about these two shames, and he said, this is something that you need to let go. And of course, you're going to be criticized by the world because of it. And sadly, you're going to be criticized by those in the church, because there are still a lot of people in the church who have this financially successful mentality and have criticized their brothers and sisters for no good reason, because they're not doing what society has said that they needed to do. Now, maybe these Christians have followed the financially successful, and they saw that, this plan works. Now, if that's something that they want to do, that's fine. But, these laws shouldn't be pushed on their fellow man. If anything, you're a Christian, you need to follow God's law and what he wants you to do. And to push your brothers and sisters into a place of tyranny where the burden on them is too heavy, then you're only putting them into bondage. And you think you're doing God a justice, but if you really looked in Scripture, you would find that, God is the source. God is Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. Now, man has learned in this world that he cannot look to God. He has to look to himself only. And you have these, these cliches from this place of a lack of faith and, not looking to God. And the cliche is, if you do your part, God will do his. Which, in this world, doing your part means doing everything. You can't leave anything to God, because that would be considered crazy and irresponsible. And the other one is God helps those who help themselves. You need to look at that historically, what that meant. And so these things came from that place of a lack of faith in somebody that has never trusted God but has trusted themselves. So, man is taught that he can't look to God. He has to, work to become financially successful for his family. Now, you may have seen the movie Sling Blade with Billy Bob Thornton. And in it, he meets this boy, Carl. And he learns from Carl that his dad committed suicide because he felt like he couldn't provide for his family. And the boy said that he thought that they got along just fine. And this is the tyranny that more or less I'm speaking of, because these laws are put on you generation after generation. If you don't follow these laws, then you're breaking the cultural pattern that the world has set up. And this is something that is an unneeded burden. Men don't need to follow something that's going to put them into bondage. If anything, men go to their jobs every day, to work, but it doesn't mean that they have to toil. Now, I'm not saying that going to college is wrong, because maybe you want to learn a certain occupation. There's nothing wrong with that, but I believe you need to know what is the driving force behind that. Are you desiring to make more money? And is this desire going to be something that's going to put you into bondage? If you get into this job, can you learn God is your source? Or is this going to be pushed on you to be the source yourself? When I started my faith walk, I was still unsure, because here I'm hearing all these things, all these lessons that I've learned from God, these revelations, and I was just too scared to speak them to my brothers who were still in bondage. I was afraid of speaking my mind against, anyone that still held on to these, worldly responsibilities. And I was intimidated, and I just kept it to myself because, like I said, I was unsure. But the more I looked at this bondage, the more I realized that what God had, revealed to me was true, because men are under an unneeded bondage. And the only way to really be free from it is surrendering your will to God, and then allowing Him to minister to you, allowing Him to speak to you. All you need to say is, Lord, I just ask that you would reveal to me everything that I'm learning that has put me into bondage. Is what I'm following right now bondage? Is it tyranny? Is it something that's taking my freedom away? What else in our Christian walk do we believe that is not true? So God had more or less caused me to question everything that I believed. It's like being a 17 follower. We learn things in this world now that we learned isn't true, so we put away that thinking. I've learned things, being a 17 follower, that I realized the things that I thought were true were not true at all. I've been lied to. We've been lied to. But I can't say we until people that look into the information themselves. So, in this video, I more or less just wanted to go more in depth into this thinking and this mentality of man being the main breadwinner. That it is not something that God had set up. It's something man has set up. And these are laws that men have put upon each other, to keep them in bondage. And whether or not they knew it or not, they were used by Satan to keep people in that place and not experience God as the source and not to experience freedom. So, I would just suggest to look at my two videos, The Main Breadwinner, 1 and 2. And you got to scroll down, it's probably in the middle of all my videos. I think I have like around 350. But, if you're a new time, watcher, I would just suggest, go to video 1 and, listen from there. And these are just all these things that God had revealed to me, that freed me from this bondage. And I'm still on the path of learning, what is true and what is false. And if something is false, it's something that I need to be rid of. So, we're all in this. We all can experience the freedom. And, when we learn that something is not true, then we just need to get rid of it, so that we can experience this freedom. So I'm going to end it here. And if I feel like I need to go more in depth with this, then I will create a part 3. So thank you for taking the time to watch. I'm going to watch this video and see if I feel like there is a need for a part 3. So thanks for taking the time to watch.